The cabin roof held under 6 feet of snow, while Lars Eriksson watched from inside through a gap in the shutters, listening to the wind finally die after 3 days of blizzard. Across the small valley, where Thomas Kern's cabin had stood that morning, there was now only a collapsed pile of timber and snow that had crushed everything inside. Before we continue, let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced a blizzard that changed how you thought about shelter, and if stories of frontier survival speak to you. Subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Lars Eriksson was 34 years old the winter his brother died. He had survived 8 winters on the high ridge above the valley, trapping marten and fox in the dense pine forests that covered the slopes. The ridge settlement was small. Just 7 cabins scattered across a plateau that sat at 8,000 feet elevation. Norwegian and German immigrants mostly, men who had come west seeking furs and freedom from crowded eastern settlements. The elevation meant shorter summers and brutal winters, but it also meant fewer competitors and abundant game. Lars had built his cabin in 1839, the same year Henrik arrived from Wisconsin to join him. Henrik was younger by 6 years. Optimistic where Lars was cautious, talkative where Lars preferred silence. They had worked well together, running separate trap lines but sharing a camp, splitting the work of survival between them. Henrik had built his own cabin 50 yards from Lars's the previous spring, declaring he needed space to court a woman from the valley town if he ever convinced one to come up the mountain. Lars had helped him raise the walls and frame the roof, using the same notched log construction every mountain man knew. 4 days of work, and Henrik had a home. February 12, 1846, began as an unremarkable winter day. Lars checked his trap lines in the morning, returned by midday with 2 marten. The sky was gray, and the temperature was dropping, but that was normal for February at this elevation. By evening, the wind had picked up. By midnight, a blizzard had engulfed the ridge with a ferocity Lars had rarely seen. Snow fell so thick he could not see Henrik's cabin from his own window. The wind drove the snow horizontally, building drifts against anything that blocked its path. Lars woke in the darkness to a sound that made his blood cold. A sharp crack like a gunshot, followed by a thunderous crash and the splintering of wood. He grabbed his coat and struggled to open his door against the accumulated snow. The wind nearly knocked him down as he pushed outside. He could barely see through the driving snow, but he knew immediately what had happened. Henrik's cabin roof had collapsed. Lars fought through waist-deep snow, shouting his brother's name into the wind. When he reached the cabin, he found the roof timbers had given way under the weight of accumulated snow. The ridge beam had snapped at its center, and the entire structure had folded inward. Snow and timber filled the interior. Lars began digging with his bare hands, then ran back for a shovel. He dug for 3 hours in the blizzard, finally reaching Henrik's body buried under 4 feet of snow and broken logs. His brother had died instantly when the roof came down. The blizzard continued for 2 more days. Lars sat alone in his cabin, unable to bury Henrik until the storm passed. He stared at his own ceiling beams, listening to the wind, hearing occasional creaks from the weight accumulating above. His roof held, but he understood how close the margin was. The same design that had failed on Henrik's cabin was above his head right now. When the storm finally cleared on the 15th, Lars buried his brother on the ridge overlook where they had often sat together watching the sunset. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night unable to sleep, staring at his ceiling, thinking about weight and timber and failure. Lars spent the month of March studying roofs. He walked between the 7 cabins in the settlement, examining every ridge beam, every joint, every angle. The other settlers thought grief had unbalanced him. They saw him standing in the snow, staring upward at roof lines, making marks in a small notebook he had begun carrying. Thomas Kern, a German trapper who had lived on the ridge for 12 years, told him directly that obsessing over Henrik's death would not bring him back. Lars did not argue. He simply continued his observations. Traditional cabin roofs on the ridge followed the same basic design every mountain man learned. 2 sloped planes met at a center ridge beam that ran the length of the cabin. The ridge beam was the highest point of the structure, supported by vertical posts or gable walls at each end. Angled rafters ran from the ridge beam down to the top logs of the cabin walls, creating the familiar peaked shape. The design was simple, quick to build, and adequate for most purposes. But Lars had begun to see its fatal flaw. The ridge beam carried enormous stress. Every pound of snow that accumulated on the roof transferred its weight through the rafters to that single center beam. The heavier the snow load, the more force concentrated at the ridge. The beam had to resist not only vertical compression, but also the outward thrust of the rafters trying to spread apart under load. In most climates, this design worked adequately. At 8,000 feet elevation, where winter storms could drop 6 feet of snow in 3 days, the design was marginal at best. Lars began visiting lower elevation settlements when the snow melted enough to make travel possible. He rode down to the valley town and talked to carpenters there. He visited abandoned mining camps in the foothills and examined collapsed structures. A pattern emerged that confirmed his suspicions. When roofs failed, they almost always failed at the ridge beam. The center would crack or split, unable to bear the concentrated load. Once the ridge beam failed, the entire roof structure collapsed inward. He found cabins where the walls still stood solid, but the roof had folded down the middle like a closing book. He studied how snow accumulated. It did not distribute evenly across a roof. Wind patterns and the roof's geometry affected where snow built up deepest. On a traditional peaked roof, snow tended to accumulate near the ridgeline, exactly where the structure was most vulnerable. Heavy snow would bridge across the peak, creating a continuous load along the entire length of the ridge beam. The weight compounded. Each new storm added to the existing accumulation. By late April, Lars had filled his notebook with observations and rough sketches. He understood the problem clearly now. The shape itself was flawed. Concentrating all structural stress at a single high point was asking for failure under extreme loads. Other trappers accepted roof collapses as inevitable tragedy. Lars refused to accept that inevitability. There had to be a better way. He simply had to discover what it was. April turned to May, and the snow on the ridge finally melted enough to reveal the underlying landscape. Lars spent his days checking trap lines, but his mind remained occupied with the roof problem. He had identified the weakness in traditional design, but understanding what was wrong did not automatically reveal what was right. He needed a solution, not just an analysis of failure. The answer came from observation, not education. Lars was walking a creek bed in early May when he noticed how snow behaved on the rock formations above him. The mountains were still covered in snow above 7,000 feet, and the patterns of accumulation varied dramatically based on terrain. Snow piled deep on rounded summits and flat plateaus. But on sharp ridges and steep ravines, snow slid off or formed separate accumulations on either side of the divide. He stopped walking and stared upward at a particular rock formation. 2 steep slopes met at a sharp V-shaped ravine. Snow had accumulated on both slopes, but the ravine itself remained largely clear. The snow could not bridge the gap because the angle was too steep. Lars sat down on a boulder and thought about that observation for a long time. Traditional cabin roofs were inverted versions of that ravine. They peaked upward, creating a ridge where snow could accumulate. What if he reversed the concept entirely? What if the center of the roof was the lowest point instead of the highest point? What if 2 steep plains met at a downward-pointing valley instead of an upward-pointing ridge? He pulled out his notebook and began sketching. The design looked strange on paper. 2 roof planes angled steeply downward, meeting at a center trough that ran the length of the cabin. The valley would be where a traditional ridge beam normally sat, but instead of being the highest structural point, it would be the lowest. He sketched the forces involved. Snow accumulating on each roof plane would push outward toward the cabin walls. The walls themselves would bear the load, not a single center beam. Walls were the strongest part of any log cabin, vertical stacks of heavy timber resting on the ground. Transferring the roof load to the walls made structural sense. But there was an obvious problem. Water would flow to the lowest point. A valley roof would collect rainwater and melting snow directly at its center. Every builder knew you shed water away from a structure, not toward its middle. This was why no one built valley roofs. The waterproofing challenge seemed insurmountable. Lars thought about the steep angles he had observed in nature. If the roof planes were steep enough, perhaps 60 degrees instead of the normal 30 to 40 degrees, water would not pool. It would flow down the valley like a gutter, and off the ends of the roof, snow would behave. Similarly, instead of accumulating in the valley, it would slide off the steep surfaces before building to dangerous depths. The valley itself would remain clear, just like the rock ravine he had observed. Lars left the ridge in late May with 2 pack horses loaded with furs from the winter's trapping. The journey down to the valley town took 2 days through muddy spring trails. Other trappers made this journey to sell furs and spend their earnings on whiskey and entertainment. Lars had different priorities. He sold his furs to a merchant for a fair price, then spent the next week purchasing materials that made the merchant think he had lost his mind. He bought 60 pounds of iron strapping, flat bars 3 inches wide and 1/4 inch thick. He bought coal tar pitch in sealed ceramic jars, expensive because it had to be shipped from the east. He bought rolls of birch bark that voyageurs used for canoe construction. He bought specialized woodworking tools, including a draw knife and a froe for splitting planks. He bought square-cut nails by the pound. The total cost consumed most of his fur money. Other trappers in town saw his purchases and made jokes. One asked if he was building a church on the mountain. Another suggested he was planning to roof his cabin with iron. Lars ignored the comments and loaded his supplies carefully onto the pack horses. The iron strapping alone weighed enough that he had to balance the load precisely. He bought oats for the horses and began the journey back up the mountain. The trip took 3 days with the heavy load. When he arrived back at his cabin, Thomas Kern stopped by to see what he had brought. Kern examined the iron strapping and shook his head. He told Lars he was wasting money on nonsense. Lars thanked him for his opinion and began unloading. The first phase of work involved selecting timber. Lars needed specific trees for his design. He spent 2 weeks walking the forest, marking trees that met his requirements. He wanted straight-grained pine or fir, at least 12 inches in diameter, with minimal taper and no significant branches for the first 20 feet of trunk. These trees would provide the primary structural members. He marked 30 trees before he began cutting. Felling and limbing the trees took another 2 weeks. Lars worked alone, using a crosscut saw and axe. He stripped the bark completely from each log using his draw knife, a tedious process that revealed the wood's true grain and condition. He rejected 5 logs that showed hidden rot or twist once the bark was removed. The remaining logs were dragged to his cabin site using the horses. Each log was positioned near where it would eventually be used. Lars spent evenings testing different pieces of wood. He would support a beam across 2 stumps and load it with rocks, measuring how much it deflected under weight. He was teaching himself structural engineering through observation and experiment. He had no formal training, but he had time and motivation. By mid-July, he had all his materials gathered, and his existing cabin roof was ready to be dismantled. The actual construction could begin. Lars began construction on July 20th by removing his existing roof completely. He worked carefully, salvaging planks and beams that could be reused. The cabin walls remained solid, 4 courses of thick logs notched at the corners. But the walls needed reinforcement before he could build his new roof. Traditional walls only had to support vertical loads from above. Lars's inverted design would create outward thrust, lateral forces pushing the walls apart. He needed to prevent that spreading. He cut heavy cross beams from his straightest logs and installed them inside the cabin, connecting opposite walls at ceiling height. These tie beams would resist the outward forces from the roof. He notched them into the top wall logs and pegged them in place with wooden pins driven through drilled holes. 3 tie beams spaced evenly along. The cabin's length created a rigid internal frame. The walls could no longer spread apart under load. With the walls reinforced, Lars began constructing the inverted roof frame. He started at one end of the cabin, setting 2 principal rafters that would define the geometry. Each rafter was a carefully selected log, stripped and shaped to consistent dimensions. The rafters met at the center line of the cabin, but instead of joining at a peak above the walls, they joined at a valley below where a traditional ridge would sit. The angle was steep, close to 60 degrees from horizontal. The rafters extended down to the top of each wall where Lars had cut notches to receive them. The valley joint was the critical element. This was where the two roof planes met at their lowest point. Lars used his iron strapping here, cutting pieces to exact lengths and bending them to follow the valley angle. He positioned iron straps on both sides of the valley joint, sandwiching the rafters between. Metal reinforcement. He drilled holes through the iron and wood, then drove bolts through the entire assembly. The iron prevented the rafters from spreading apart or shifting under load. It was not a traditional joint that any frontier carpenter would recognize, but it was engineered for a specific purpose. Lars repeated this process along the length of the cabin, installing paired rafters every 2 feet. Each pair met at the center valley and was reinforced with iron strapping. The frame slowly took shape, and neighbors began stopping to stare. The structure looked fundamentally wrong to anyone familiar with cabin construction. Roofs were supposed to peak upward, shedding water to the sides. Lars's frame created a trough down the middle that appeared designed to collect water rather than shed it. Otto Reinhardt, the settlement's eldest resident at 62 years old, came to examine the work. He walked around the cabin twice, studying the frame from every angle. Finally, he spoke. He told Lars the craftsmanship was impressive, but the design was backwards. Water would pool in that valley and rot the wood within 2 seasons. Lars explained his theory about steep angles and drainage. Otto shook his head and walked away, convinced Lars was building an elaborate failure. The frame was complete by early August, but Lars knew the structure was useless without proper waterproofing. The valley running down the center of his roof was the design's greatest vulnerability. If water pooled there or seeped through to the interior, the entire innovation would fail. Lars had spent months thinking about this problem. Now he had to prove his solution would work. He began with birch bark, the same material voyageurs used to make waterproof canoes. He had purchased 20 rolls of bark from the valley merchant, each roll 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. Lars soaked the bark in heated water to make it pliable, then laid strips along the valley joint, overlapping each piece like shingles. The bark naturally curled, and he had to weight it down with rocks while it dried in position. He worked from the bottom of the valley upward, ensuring each piece overlapped the one below it. Water flowing down would travel over the seams, not under them. The bark layer took 3 days to install properly. Once it was in place and dried, Lars moved to the second layer. He heated his coal tar pitch in an iron pot over a fire until it liquefied into thick black syrup. Using a brush made from pine boughs, he painted the pitch over the entire bark surface. The pitch soaked into the bark and filled every gap between strips. As it cooled, it hardened into a flexible, waterproof membrane. The smell was powerful, and his hands became coated in black residue that took days to scrub clean. Over the pitched bark, Lars installed split wooden planks. He had spent 2 weeks splitting straight-grained logs into boards roughly 1 inch thick and 6 inches wide. These planks were laid lengthwise along the valley and up both roof planes, overlapping like shingles, with the lower edge of each plank covering the upper edge of the plank below it. He pegged each plank to the rafters using whittled wooden pins. The planks created channels that would guide water down the roof surface and into the valley, then along the valley to gutters he had fashioned at each end using hollowed log sections. The fourth and final layer was living sod. Lars cut sections of meadow grass with their root systems intact, each piece roughly 1 foot square and 3 inches thick. He laid these sod pieces over the entire roof, grass side up. The roots would knit together and the grass would grow, creating a living roof that would absorb light rain and transpire moisture through the plants. Heavy rain or snowmelt would overwhelm the sod and flow through to the wooden channels beneath, but the sod provided insulation and additional waterproofing. Thomas Kern visited while Lars was laying the final sod pieces. He examined the layered system and admitted the craftsmanship was thorough. But he remained skeptical about the fundamental design. He told Lars the valley might not leak, but it would still collect snow weight and collapse when winter came. Lars did not argue. He simply continued working. Lars completed his roof in mid-September, just as the first autumn storms began moving through the high country. The entire project had consumed 11 weeks of continuous work, far longer than the 4 days a traditional cabin required. He had worked alone except for occasional help moving heavy beams. His hands were calloused and scarred from months of handling rough timber and tools. But the cabin was finished, and he moved his supplies back inside to wait for winter. The first snow came on October 9th. Lars woke to find 3 inches of fresh powder covering everything. By midday, the storm had intensified, and snow fell steadily through the afternoon. By evening, when the storm finally cleared, 12 inches had accumulated. Lars stepped outside and examined his roof. Snow sat on both steep plains in even layers. The center valley remained visible as a clear depression running the length of the cabin. The snow had not bridged across the gap. Each roof plane held its own separate accumulation. He climbed onto the roof using a ladder he had built for this purpose. The snow compressed slightly under his weight, but felt stable. He walked carefully to the valley and looked down into it. The trough was clear except for a light dusting of snow that had blown in. He could see the wooden planks beneath. The steep 60-degree angle prevented snow from accumulating in the valley itself. Everything was working as he had calculated. Over the next week, 2 more storms added another 10 inches of snow. Lars monitored his roof after each storm, climbing up to examine the accumulation pattern. The snow continued to behave predictably. Each roof plane held separate loads that pressed outward toward the walls. The valley remained clear. Inside the cabin, Lars felt no sagging or creaking from the structure above. The tie beams he had installed were handling the outward thrust perfectly. Other cabins in the settlement were showing different results. Traditional roofs were accumulating snow at their ridge lines, creating continuous loads along the center beams. Thomas Kern's cabin showed visible sagging at the ridge peak. Otto Reinhardt's roof had developed a noticeable dip in the middle. Both men spent time shoveling snow off their roofs to reduce the load, dangerous work that required climbing on snow-covered surfaces. Wilhelm Adler, a quiet Norwegian trapper who lived on the far edge of the settlement, visited Lars in late October. He had been watching Lars's construction all summer without comment. Now he asked detailed questions about the valley design, the iron reinforcement, the angle calculations, and the waterproofing layers. Lars answered everything honestly, even offering to show Adler his notebooks. Adler thanked him and left without stating his intentions. Thomas Kern also visited, but remained unconvinced. He told Lars that 2 feet of snow was not a real test. A serious blizzard would prove whether the design worked or failed. Lars agreed. He knew the true test would come when a major storm hit the ridge. Until then, he could only wait and monitor his roof through the normal accumulation of winter snowfall. January 27, 1847, began with falling temperatures and a sky the color of old iron. Lars had seen enough mountain winters to recognize the signs of a major storm building. By noon, the first snowflakes were falling. By evening, the wind had picked up and snow was coming down heavily. Lars secured his cabin, brought in extra firewood, and filled every container with water. He knew he might be trapped inside for days. The blizzard intensified through the night. Wind drove snow horizontally across the ridge, building massive drifts against any obstacle. Lars sat by his fireplace, listening to the storm howl outside. He could hear the wind testing his roof, pressing against the steep plains, trying to find weakness. But he heard no creaking, no cracking, no sounds of structural distress. The cabin felt solid around him. The storm continued without pause through the entire next day and into the second night. Snow accumulated at rates Lars had never witnessed. When he opened his door briefly on the morning of the second day, snow had drifted 4 feet high against the walls. He could barely see 20 feet through the driving snow. He closed the door and returned to waiting. On the third night, he heard a sound that cut through the wind, a sharp crack followed by a massive crash, the unmistakable sound of a roof collapsing. The sound came from the direction of Thomas Kern's cabin. Lars moved to his window, but could see nothing through the blizzard. He could only wait and hope Kern had survived. Another crash came an hour later from a different direction, then a third sometime after midnight. Lars stopped counting. He focused on his own roof, listening to the weight accumulating above him. He heard snow sliding off occasionally in controlled releases, the sound of small avalanches as sections broke free from the steep plains. The valley was doing its job, preventing snow from bridging across and creating unified loads. Each plain was shedding its accumulation independently. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the fourth day. The wind died and snow stopped falling. Lars waited until full daylight before opening his door. He had to shovel through 3 feet of drift to get outside. When he finally emerged, the landscape had transformed into an alien world of white. Drifts reached the roof lines of some cabins. The trees were buried to their lower branches. 3 cabins had lost their roofs completely. Thomas Kern's cabin was a collapsed ruin of timber and snow. Otto Reinhardt's roof had folded inward at the center. Johann Becker's cabin, on the lowest edge of the settlement, showed only broken wall tops above the snow. Lars felt sick seeing the destruction. He immediately began moving through the deep snow toward Kern's cabin, shouting for survivors. Thomas Kern emerged from Wilhelm Adler's cabin, where he had taken shelter after his roof collapsed. He was alive, but everything he owned was buried or destroyed. The settlement took stock of the damage over the following week. 3 cabins had been destroyed by roof collapse. 2 others had suffered serious structural damage, requiring major repairs. Only 2 cabins had survived the blizzard intact. Lars's cabin, with its inverted valley roof, stood undamaged. Wilhelm Adler's cabin, built the previous summer using a modified version of Lars's design after their October conversation, had also survived without failure. The surviving settlers gathered at Lars's cabin on February 5th to discuss rebuilding. Thomas Kern, Johann Becker, and Otto Reinhardt had all lost their primary shelter. They were living temporarily with neighbors or in hastily constructed lean-tos. They needed proper roofs before the next storm arrived. The conversation was quiet and practical. No one made jokes about Lars's upside-down design anymore. The evidence was visible across the ridge. Traditional roofs had failed. Valley roofs had survived. Thomas Kern spoke first. He asked Lars directly if he would help him rebuild using the inverted roof technique. His pride was gone, replaced by simple need for shelter that would not kill him. Lars agreed immediately. Otto Reinhardt asked the same, then Johann Becker. Lars told them he would share everything he knew, every technique and measurement, every lesson he had learned through construction and testing. The rebuilding began in mid-February during a stretch of clear weather. Lars worked alongside Thomas Kern, teaching him the critical elements. The 60-degree roof angle that prevented snow accumulation in the valley, the iron strapping reinforcement at the valley joint, the tie beams inside the cabin to resist outward thrust, the layered waterproofing system using birch bark, coal tar pitch, wooden channels, and living sod. Kern was a skilled carpenter and learned quickly. His new roof took 3 weeks to complete, far longer than traditional construction, but built to survive. Wilhelm Adler helped Otto Reinhardt with his rebuilding. Johann Becker worked with another settler who had carpentry experience. By late April, all 3 destroyed cabins had been rebuilt with valley roofs. 2 other settlers whose cabins had survived decided to replace their damaged traditional roofs preemptively rather than risk another collapse. By summer, 6 of the 7 cabins on the ridge featured inverted valley roof designs. Word spread beyond the settlement. Trappers traveling through the area saw the unusual architecture and asked questions. Lars explained his techniques to anyone interested. He made rough sketches showing the basic geometry and structural principles. Some visitors were skeptical, but most recognized the practical value after hearing about the blizzard that had destroyed half the traditional roofs, while valley roofs stood firm. Over the next 5 years, the valley roof design spread to other high-elevation settlements throughout the territory. Variations emerged as different builders adapted the core principles to their specific needs and available materials. Some used different angles, some modified the waterproofing layers, but the fundamental concept remained consistent. Put the valley at the center, make the angle steep, reinforce the joint, distribute the load to the walls. The technique acquired different names in different places, but trappers and settlers began calling it the Ericsson roof. Lars Ericsson continued trapping on the ridge for another 18 years. After the blizzard of '47, he never married, never left the mountains for more than brief trips to sell furs and purchase supplies. He lived quietly in the cabin with the inverted roof, the structure that had saved his life and changed how men built shelter at high elevations. The cabin required minimal maintenance over those years. The living sod roof needed occasional patching where grass died back. The wooden channels needed replacement once after a decade of use, but the basic structure remained solid through 18 more winters of heavy snow. By the early 1860s, Lars was in his 50s and feeling the accumulated wear of mountain life. His joints ached in cold weather. His hands, damaged by years of hard work and frostbite, struggled with fine tasks. He made his last trip down to the valley in the spring of 1865 and did not return to the ridge. He settled in a small house on the outskirts of the valley town, living on savings from his trapping years. He rarely spoke about his time in the mountains. Lars died of pneumonia in the winter of 1869. He was 57 years old. The local minister conducted a brief service attended by a handful of people who had known him as the quiet man who had once trapped the high country. He was buried in the town cemetery under a simple wooden marker. The marker gave his name, birth year, and death year. It made no mention of roofs or innovations or the lives his design had saved. On the ridge, his cabin still stood. New occupants had moved in after Lars left, trappers and prospectors who appreciated finding solid shelter already built. The inverted roof continued performing exactly as designed, shedding snow through steep angles and distributed loads. The settlement had grown to 18 structures by the 1870s, every one of them featuring valley roof construction. Travelers passing through called it the upside-down village, but residents simply called it home. The technique spread further as alpine settlement expanded westward. Construction guides published in the 1870s included references to reverse-pitch valley roofs for extreme snow load conditions. The descriptions were often crude and the engineering principles poorly explained, but the basic concept persisted. Build the valley at the center, make it steep, reinforce the joint, distribute the load. Builders who followed those principles created structures that survived where traditional designs failed. Modern historians studying frontier construction methods occasionally encounter references to Ericsson roofs in old journals and letters from high-elevation settlements. The innovation required no new materials, no advanced technology, just a willingness to question assumptions about how roofs should be built. Lars had refused to accept his brother's death as inevitable tragedy. He had observed, calculated, experimented, and built something that looked wrong but worked perfectly. The roofs remained scattered across old mountain settlements, weathered and often abandoned, silent monuments to what grief and determination could engineer when a man decided the impossible was simply a problem waiting for solution.